Years ago, my home network was a $40 router. It was a normal setup, until it wasn't. Today, I have an 8-foot tall server rack, 5 separate networks, and I spent over $1,000 on just 2 network switches. It is one heck of a journey, and we're going to make a couple stops along the way for some epic fails. Chapter 1: The Cringe Years. Going back to the beginning of this channel and my first apartment, I used to mine on old GPUs to heat up the place in the winter. Running Ethernet and $20 gigabit switches was easily managed in a one-bedroom setup, and at this point, the network was really just a means of sharing internet to these computers. Fast forward a bit, and 2 apartments later, I discovered 2 things that started the network obsession: Pi-hole and network storage. Pi-hole has been on this channel both for blocking ads, trackers, and malware, but most recently for blocking Windows updates for servers until I'm actually ready for them to go offline. My first NAS was also part of the library server, and the need for network storage started when my home DVD collection exceeded that of a single 4TB drive. Plus, I was starting to get serious about the channel and wanted to keep all of my exports and most source footage. Also around this time, I discovered Octoprint, where your 3D printer is connected over USB to a Raspberry Pi, letting you fully control the printer over the network, eliminating the need to pop a memory card in and out all the time, among other things. Now I'm at the point where outside of mining in the winter, I actually have to think about where to position Ethernet cables and switches. Chapter 2: Getting Janky with It. This is when Project IBM started. I didn't know it at the time, but this is when the word rack mount would become the most searched word in my shopping history. Before any construction started, the goal for Project IBM was literally just to take some light sensors, point them at a 100 megabit switch, and use the light sensor to make a bank of ice cube relays, produce a bunch of clicky sounds based on network activity. Having a retro computer make mechanical sounds when you start downloading a time-lapse off the 3D printer, or a few seconds of chatter as I upload a new file to print, seemed like a really fun idea at the time. Of course, that never came to be. I needed a gigabit network switch, so Project IBM grew to actually be the backbone of my home network at the last apartment. Before moving into a house, IBM had 2 racks. The left side was standard 19-inch and metal. The right side was for 3D printing some custom rack mount brackets that would fit in the 3D printer's 12-inch wide print area. The network storage at the time was on a mining frame zip-tied to a 1U shelf. I had 4 Raspberry Pi 3Bs, 2 for blocking ads, and 2 for controlling the pair of CR10s I had at the time. I don't remember if I had another one hosting Linux ISOs or not, but by using a 100 megabit switch, I limited all the Raspberry Pi's total combined throughput to the rest of the network, capped at 100 megabits, ensuring I'd always have at least 900 left over for my workstation to use for internet or network access. I did get to add some of the retro clicky compute sounds by putting relays on the Raspberry Pis to go off with SD card activity, but it still fell short of the 40 relays I had originally planned. Still though, better than nothing. Chapter 3: Too Fast, Too Jank. Once I had a house and no longer had a landlord, I immediately started running Ethernet through the attic.
In order to continue doing Ultimate Tech House videos, there's a lot of behind the scenes, or rather behind the walls, upgrades that need to take place. Now, since filming the first 2 episodes, I've actually relocated out of the DFW Metroplex area, out to a very, very small town. Just to understand how big of a change that is, here's a map of the US states with less population than just the DFW metro area. So, it's a pretty big transition, and as part of that transition, there is no fiber internet out here, obviously. So, I need to lengthen some coax. This cable doesn't move out of the way. It makes it really hard to get up in the attic to do stuff. So, step 1, replace that 1-foot section with whatever amount of length this is. I imagine any other cable the technician had would have been long enough. We've got this white one here going between there and there. I can already see the 50-foot HDMI cable over there. That's going to come back over here and down through this hatch to the server rack. And then I've got a blue cable way off over yonder. I'm going to have to crawl over that to get to it. And there's another Ethernet cable, the Cat6, that I'm going to relocate to the other side. And there's supposedly a dowel rod sticking 4 feet up into the attic that should mark the spot where that goes. Alright, so here's that Cat6 Ethernet cable that I was trying to get 2.5 gig out of. Didn't quite work. Over there, not sure if you can really see, is some blue Cat8 that I fed up from my editing room. That's going to go all the way back down there, and I'm going to take the end of that Cat6 and feed it right here where I shoved that dowel rod through the ceiling. And here on this top switch, which has a couple 10 gig ports, this is the network storage here, and this is the cable we just ran. 2 green lights means 10 gig on ports 9 and 10. And indeed, we have 2 green lights. Not exactly all 10 gigabit, but keep in mind that the array we're writing and reading from is just 6 mechanical hard drives. So, with no cache, that's not bad.
More on getting 10 gig working later. I went to Home Depot, picked up some 2x4s and a second set of metal server rack rails, and started the process of going full rack mount. Of course, I built the rack before buying any cases for the NAS. Turns out the case was 2 inches deeper than the rack I built, so it sat under the 3D printing table, propped up on some IKEA shelves. The network was working great, so naturally it was time to change things. I could edit off the drives in the NAS just as well as if they were actually in the computer. The only downside was 1 gigabit speeds, having to wait literal minutes every time I dumped screen capture footage. It got pretty old pretty fast. But then I remembered a Linus Tech Tips video showing how a cheap multi-port network card could combine connections, sort of like RAID 0 or SLI for your network. Sadly, Windows 10, even Pro, cannot do that anymore, which made the $30 I spent on dual gigabit network cards from 2005 useless. Well, kinda. It works in Linux just fine. Next, I spent $80 for a pair of 2.5 gigabit network cards and $100 for a 10 gig capable switch. Windows picked it up just fine. Linux had some issues. FreeNAS would not recognize it. Neither would Proxmox. Even desktop distributions won't recognize it. However, Unraid did work. 2.5 gig network speed ran just fine. So I copied the entire network storage array to some external drives, which I had to buy more of so it would fit, and reformatted everything and set up Unraid. And while Unraid did have faster network speeds, in practice, because I'm working with multi-gig files one at a time, and Unraid doesn't split up individual files, I was basically running at single drive speeds, and file transfers larger than the 64 gig SSD cache would just crash. I did try to get ZFS on Unraid working. I got as far as creating the pool and command line, but I got stuck on the final step where I couldn't make it visible to the network. Spent 2 whole days searching online for help. Nothing worked. Wanting to go back to FreeNAS, now called TrueNAS, I learned that it's basically 1 gig or 10 gig for network. So at this point, just sitting in a closet, I have multi-port gigabit network cards, 2.5 gigabit cards, and a multi-gigabit network switch. Not wanting to spend $250 on 10 gigabit network cards, I hit up eBay specifically looking at used enterprise gear. I came across the Intel X540 chipset NICs. I found a pair for $100, and they were even local, so I got same-day pickup. Perks of living in DFW. FreeNAS picked up the dual 10 gig car immediately. Windows 10 did need a driver download, but the other thing to note are PCIe lane requirements. This X540-T2 card needs 8 lanes. Just because it fits in your motherboard doesn't mean it's actually wired for it. Most boards I see are by 4 or by 2 in the secondary slot, not by 8. X8 boards in the secondary slot usually advertise as SLI ready, so that would be a good place to start looking. I did have to swap motherboards on my workstation in order to get it to work. So that's the story of how I tried to avoid splurging on 10 gig, but ended up paying twice as much to get it anyway. As for FreeNAS/TrueNAS, the cache does fill up as you start a huge file transfer, but instead of crashing, you actually drop down to the actual storage speed of the pool. Currently, I drop to about 300 megabytes per second, and I'll cover RAID types and write speeds later on in this video. I also liked that I could literally wipe the OS, install something completely different, and still access my pool, even with a drive or two missing. Oh, and the bit rot protection? Don't even get me started. Here's a video I recorded less than 8 years ago. You can see this video is corrupted. But now that I have stuff protected by ZFS, it's not going to happen to something valuable like family photos. Having that added peace of mind is worth a lot. I've even gone so far as to get a Ryzen CPU and ECC memory. Now that I've solved all the software and networking issues, it's time to start spending money again. I treated myself to a Ubiquiti Dream Machine and 48-port switch that also has 4 10GB SFP Plus ports. I was already looking at a switch upgrade since the 2 10GB ports on my old switch weren't enough for everything I wanted. While I could direct connect to clients with the dual 10GB on the NAS, I wanted to keep more options open for getting above 1GB access to other clients on the network. The UniFi switch is managed, so it supports using multiple Ethernet connections to combine speeds for Linux clients, just like Windows used to, but now doesn't. Later on, I discovered the joys of power and Ethernet in the same cable. Security cameras, Raspberry Pis, Android devices, access points, all powered by PoE. My little office, which is only 4 foot by 6, has a single 10GB connection for the workstation, plus 4 PoE gigabit connections. By adding an access point in here, my phone, which also doubles as my camera, uploads footage across the network 5 times faster back here. By the time Adobe Premiere opens up, everything has uploaded to the NAS. I wish I knew about PoE sooner, because then I wouldn't have had to buy this USB power supply for all the Raspberry Pis. It is not cheap. It sells for $300 new, but I did manage to find a used one in Houston for about $100. At this point, the wooden rack could transfer files fast, route securely thanks to Pi-hole DNS filtering and some of the UniFi firewall settings I had in place. The only thing my network didn't have at this point were computing resources. Thanks to YouTube videos showing Mulan upsampled to 60 FPS with AI, I knew I had to build a server to get started on my own movie collection. I pulled the 3900X and 2080 Super from my workstation, dropping down to a 3600 and RX 480, so that the movie upsampling server could run more quickly. The first 4U rack mount PC case I had was actually for mining originally, but because I picked it up during the mining bust, it was only $80. But because it was so deep and had no hard drive mounts, I had to get creative. Later on, I bought a set of 3 Silverstone RM400s. Those are awesome. You can fit 3 optical drives, great for ripping Blu-rays, and up to 8 3.5-inch drives natively, though not with a full-size graphics card. If you have something like a GTX 1050, that would fit fine. Having USB 3 on the front is also nice for things like backups. Chapter, whatever we're up to, doing it right. Finally, the wooden server rack is gone, and an HP Enterprise rack has taken its place. It's on wheels, it has doors, but most importantly, it's double-sided and deep, so I can actually put equipment on both sides, though perhaps not Silverstone RM400s or anything with an ATX motherboard in it, but at least for things like monitors, Raspberry Pis, switches, that should all fit both sides. Thanks to living around DFW, I was able to pick it up for under $200, and actually, I was spoiled for choice in that price range. I'll end this tale with some optimizations that I've made, and if you want to start on this new obsession, some mistakes to definitely avoid. First of all, do not boot off of a portable USB drive in TrueNAS. It is supported, but don't. It takes about 30 minutes to boot, 5 minutes more if you RAID 1 them. Instead, get a 60 gig SATA SSD in a USB 3 enclosure, and now you're booting up in under 2 minutes. Cheap hard drives. Stay away. I spotted an eBay listing for a set of 4 6TB Western Digital Golds that were last year's model, but still unused. One arrived physically destroyed, another wouldn't power up at all. Those got returned, fortunately without much hassle. Amazon is a bit safer for new old stock. Currently, of my 9 3TB drives, it's not the most efficient, but boy is it fast. And in the case of a dead drive, my rebuild time isn't that bad. 3 of the drives are Western Digital Red Pluses, 3 are Seagate Iron Wolves, and 3 are Seagate Constellation Business Class drives. The Business Class drives are about 30% cheaper and faster. The reason they're cheap is that hard drive warranty isn't based off purchase date, it's the manufacture date. So this new old stock came with no warranty. The only drive to die has been one of the new old stock, which I replaced with a WD Red since it happened to be on sale that day. You might be thinking, 9 SATA drives? What motherboard is he using? So you can get PCIe to SATA host bus adapters. Do not get a RAID card if you're using ZFS, and do not get one that fits in the NVMe SSD form factor. This one is pretty cool. It uses a 4x PCIe connection, but it died after a month. After a day of heavy use, it was toast. My guess is that it was a lack of cooling, since it definitely does not have any kind of a heatsink on it. Cool concept though. My current SATA host bus adapter has lasted a full year. Highly recommend it. A couple rack accessories worth looking into. Rack mount cooling for a Pi farm, especially if it's in a garage. These fans have the added advantage of turning off if the temperature is cool enough. A monitor mount is pretty cool. Combine it with a cheap KVM if you need mouse and keyboard access. A UPS is nice. Mine is primarily for the 3D printers and NAS. The compute computers are only surge protected. The power splitter I have is awesome for all of the AC to DC converters thanks to short power leads coming out the back. These Raspberry Pi rack mounts are super awesome. I've got links to those as well as a bunch of other stuff below. One row, 4 Pis, is all Pi-hole. 2 pairs of 2 for a couple of different networks. 2 more are Octoprint. There's a Home Assistant server, a Minecraft server, a Volumio server, and another is hooked up to the projector if I just want to watch something local off the NAS. A Pi 4 will handle Blu-rays just fine. Finally, since I had to copy everything back onto my RAID array because Unraid didn't work out, I decided to try out different configurations, RAID Z1, RAID Z2, RAID Z3, and also just straight up RAID 0. I tried with 6 drives and also with 9 drives, different RAID configurations against write speeds. All of these tests were with 32 gigs of RAM, and I copied a full 100 gigs to make sure that I definitely filled up the cache and was getting down to actual drive speed performance. With a 6-drive stripe, I was actually hitting the limits of what my C drive, which is NVMe, could handle at 640 megabytes per second. 6 drives in RAID Z1, I was averaging about 400 megabytes a second, and in RAID Z2, I was averaging about 360. Going up to 9 drives, I actually ran into a problem where because I was also using a lot of PCIe lanes, my motherboard actually disconnected 2 of its SATA ports because it didn't have the PCIe lanes for it. But apart from that, I was able to get all 9 hard drives in a stripe configuration, again maxing around 640 megabytes per second because of my C drive. RAID Z1, about 600 megabytes a second. RAID Z2, which is what I'm using, 530 megabytes per second, which, if you think about it, is kind of the limit of what you'd get with a SATA SSD anyway. And in RAID Z3 with 9 drives, it got about 450 megabytes per second. Compare that to my portable backup, which is 4 6TB drives in Microsoft storage spaces, which averages about 35 megabytes per second. As the network continues to expand, I'll try and keep making update videos, but realistically, the video is going to go up a year or two after the fact, just like this one. But if you don't want to wait a year for some tech videos, make sure to check out these playlists over here for more computer stuff. And then past or future me will see you then.